Okay. I actually didn't do the one that I wrote after or that I released to the public after the election violence. I just wasn't feeling ready to do it. The poem that I did was...
Was it the flag?
Yes, the flag and future. Okay, this one is really a piece on... it's like a self-assertion on the world. It's a statement of, I am here, I belong here, I have a right to be here. This is where I come from, this is where I'm going. And when I meet you and when I meet everyone, it is right and proper that I was here. Which I think is almost, or as important a statement. It's kind of, my generation, I think, is in this place of not, it's seeking identity, actually, is what it is. There is a kind of disconnect between what happened at independence and what is, and the generations of that time and now, and this kind of confusion of where to go following that. The piece from Flag and Future, I'd actually written also about the same period, in 2006. Because even then there was violence happening in the Rift Valley. There were strikes from the students, and this conflict, constant conflict between students and police and government. It's something that has been there, and it just kind of was accentuated by the elections that kind of went really badly, and things just kind of blew up. And so my part was to release Flag and Future as an audio piece and just kind of put it out on the internet.
Yes.
Yeah.
You wanted to show it on the project.
Yeah, it was like my contribution. I think there was a moment you felt like you had to do something. You didn't know what to do. It wasn't safe to go outside. It wasn't safe to do, to say, I mean, if you go on the street, no one really knows that you mean peace. You know, you don't mean to be violent or be killing people or anything. Everyone, it was lockdown. You were inside your house. So it was my my contribution. Is like, whoever is able to hear this, I know it's probably not the person who's actually holding a machete trying to kill someone, because they're out doing that, but whoever was able to hear it and do something, and it did have an impact, because it found its way to the local media, and it was played on the radio station at a time when people needed to hear something calming and joining, I mean, uniting.
Yeah, so Shailja, I'm sure you have a lot of things to tell us about your poem too.
Well, that poem came out of, first, I think, the heartbreak of an entire country, because I have to begin by, you know, the phrase that Ngwatilo just used, that the elections went really badly, was striking to me, because I think my perspective is that the elections went incredibly well until we had a civil coup. We had over 10 million Kenyans registered to vote, who got up at 4 in the morning, who stood in the sun for as long as 10 hours to vote. We had a huge, extraordinary historical show of faith in the possibilities of peaceful change through the ballot. Kenyans across the country sacrificing a day's income, walking for miles, getting rides to the polls in remote rural areas, an extraordinary record turnout, and for the most part the voting went very peacefully, except in certain areas where voters of certain ethnic groups were deliberately disenfranchised. In Nairobi, for example, we saw at some polling stations that all voters with a certain names from particular ethnic groups, the Luo, the minority group, were excised from the ballots. And then what we saw was, after this huge groundswell of hope that was the result of a decade of nation building, a decade of civil society educating voters, registering voters, putting the infrastructure in place to have a genuine election, we had a civil coup. We had the electoral process, the tallying process halted, we had a state of emergency declared, we had paramilitaries march into the main tallying centre, and on TV we were all watching, stunned, as the electoral process was shut down. And then 15 minutes later, the incumbent, Mwai Kibaki, was sworn in as president. It was very clear that what we witnessed was a civil coup, and what followed was the outrage of a country that had been deprived of peaceful change. What happens when 8 million people use the most peaceful, legal means available to them to say, we want change, and that is rubbished, that is trashed. And some of the statements that went out from youth groups following that was, these were a whole generation of Kenyans voting for the first time in their lives. And their right to vote, their constitutional right, their democratic right was rubbished, was trashed. So when that is taken away from you, what is your recourse? You take to the streets. People did erupt in violent protest and in rage, and then that violence took on different dimensions of armed militia being deployed, of excessive police brutality and excessive police retaliation. So that poem, the poem, first of all, begins with the heartbreak, the longing for, this dream of the Kenya that we thought was going to happen, and the waking, literally, it was the truth. I woke up in the night over and over again crying after that time, just unable to believe that this had really happened, and thinking about the huge dimensions of suffering and violence we were witnessing, and the decades of history, 5 decades, of Kenya's post-independence history that had brought us to that place, and longing, as we all do, for some time of innocence before all this began, for the longing to return to some time when everything could be started again, if we could roll back the story and tell the story again from the beginning. But we can't do that, so what does that mean? We can choose to stand in history as it exists at the moment and refuse to shut our eyes. And for me, those 6 words are really the key: breathe, see, and choose. I think there was a choice that was presented in the post-election violence to all Kenyans to choose justice and truth, or to choose to do what had been done for 50 years, which is try and paper over the cracks, try and soothe everything down, try and return to calm. And calm really meant business could proceed as usual for the moneyed classes of Kenya. The concern over the violence, the reason the violence in Kenya made international headlines, was not really because of the death toll, because of people being killed. It was because business halted, because roads were shut down, fuel supplies couldn't reach Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the DRC, containers were piling up at the port of Mombasa. So industry halted, trade halted, tourism halted, commerce halted, which meant that the interests of a political class, an industrial class, a class of corporate owners and owners of capital were threatened. And that's why there was suddenly all these calls for calm, peace, reconciliation, and the position that I and a whole coalition of Kenyans who became Kenyans for Peace, Truth and Justice took is, we can't have peace without justice. We can't have justice without the truth of the elections and the truth of our history. And that's still the position that we take today. We can't have anything like a viable peace or a viable democracy without truth and justice.